Welcome to Learning with the Cleveland Orchestra. My name is Rose Breckenridge. I'm lecturing for the Cleveland Orchestra series, Music in Depth. Today we're looking at Shostakovich and his Chamber Symphony in C minor, Opus 110A. I'll be talking about Shostakovich's life and his musical style. I'll give you background for the Chamber Symphony in C minor, plus a musical tour of the piece. Well, let's get started. Shostakovich lived from 1906 to 1975. He was born in Russia of intellectual parents who fostered a cultural home life. He displayed remarkable musical talent growing up. His mother was his first piano teacher. And at age 13, he was accepted to the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he became a brilliant pianist while also studying composition. After graduation, Shostakovich eventually chose the path of composing over a career as pianist. While coming of age, his country had gone through the Russian Revolution of 1917 to become the Soviet Union, led first by Lenin and later by Stalin. As a young man in the 1920s, Shostakovich became the poster boy composer for the new country. At first, he had relative freedom to experiment musically. His early symphonies focused on patriotic themes, but in 1927, at the suggestion of his new friend, Ivan Solortinsky, Shostakovich began to study the symphonies of Gustav Mahler. Around that time, Shostakovich also wrote a short opera, The Nose, based on a satirical story by the Russian writer Nikolai Gogol. The opera's critical reception foreshadowed the future censures of Shostakovich's music. In the early 1930s, Shostakovich premiered some ballet scores, The Golden Age, The Bolt, plus he conceived a project of writing 3 full-length operas with female protagonists. And he continued to study Mahler with the goal of writing some more serious symphonies using Mahler as his model. In 1932, he married the physicist Nina Varsar, and then they had 2 children in the late 1930s, Galina and Maxim, who would become an important conductor. Shostakovich's first full-length opera, Lady Macbeth of the Minsense District, premiered in 1934 and ran successfully for 2 years. But after Stalin attended in January of 1936, an article appeared in the communist paper Pravda, condemning the opera as a muddle instead of music. This censure shut the opera down and forced Shostakovich into silence. It was the time of Stalin's terror, and in fact, 2 of Shostakovich's friends were arrested and executed during that time. Shostakovich was finally restored to official favor at the end of 1937 with the composition of his 5th symphony, dubbed A Soviet Artist's Reply to Just Criticism. But he would never be the same. He abandoned his opera trilogy project and retreated into the safe world of composing symphonies, where he could express everything without saying anything. During World War II, Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, written during the Nazi siege of Leningrad, gave the world hope that Hitler could be defeated. But the Cold War following World War II led the West to reject Shostakovich's music as communist propaganda. In 1948, Shostakovich, along with Prokofiev and other composers in his country, became the target of a severe Soviet government censure. So he withdrew at that time from composing public works. Only after Stalin died in 1953 was Shostakovich eventually restored to official favor. In the 1950s, Shostakovich's health began to seriously deteriorate. His right hand began to wither away, and he developed mobility problems that eventually led to several falls with broken legs. He learned he had a mysterious neurological disease. Then later, he suffered several heart attacks and then developed lung cancer, dying in 1975. Well, what about his music? Shostakovich was an important 20th century symphonist. He actually composed 15 symphonies altogether. He was, as we saw earlier, very inspired by his study of the symphonies of Mahler, but also Tchaikovsky and Beethoven inspired him. His musical style is marked by a use of classical tonality along with biting dissonance, poignant lyricism along with angry sarcasm, sorrowful lamenting melodies along with angry vigorous rhythms. He employed dramatic contrasts of texture, often contrasting chamber-like textures with many solos versus full ensembles, full-throated ensembles. And he was able to employ innovative and unusual orchestrations. After his death in 1975, in 1979, a biography, testimony, purported biography, was published by Solomon Volkov, and it led to a serious reevaluation of Shostakovich's music in the West. People in the West now realize that Shostakovich's music was not mere propaganda, but rather he gave voice to his country's suffering people. But due to the Soviet censure of the arts, this voice lays hidden in multiple layers of subtext in his music, full of ambiguities and difficult to articulate. Shostakovich's music expresses many powerful and wide-ranging emotions, but above all, when we listen to Shostakovich's music, we know that he knows our pain. So what about the Chamber Symphony in C minor? This is a very interesting piece. In 1960, Shostakovich was commissioned to write the score for a film about the destruction of Dresden during World War II. So he went there to Dresden to see the still evident devastation. He also watched many films about the actual bombings, but he found himself emotionally unable to begin the film's score. Instead, in a white heat, he composed his eighth quartet, actually in 3 days, eventually giving it the official dedication of "In memory of the victims of fascism and war." The quartet is very desolate, and it reveals how depressed Shostakovich was at this time. The 1950s had not been a good decade for Shostakovich. His wife died in 1954, suddenly I might add, his mother in 1955, and then, as we discussed earlier, he learned that he had this mysterious and incurable neurological disease. He was alone and afraid, and in that state he succumbed to great official pressure and he joined the Communist Party. His guilt overwhelmed him. He was inconsolable. And he said in a letter to Isaac Glickman that this eighth quartet was actually a requiem, a memorial, if you will, to himself. The eighth quartet has 5 connected movements, and it's the most popular and frequently performed of all of Shostakovich's 15 quartets. It's extremely emotional and even confessional. It uses multiple self-quotes from other compositions by Shostakovich, plus his personal motif, musical motif, DSCH. More about that in a moment. And it's said that whenever he heard the quartet performed, he wept. In 1967, 7 years after its composition, the violist and conductor Rudolf Barschai, Shostakovich had coached him as a student, approached the composer and gained approval to arrange the quartet for string orchestra. And that's the version that we'll be doing our musical tour with today. The work has many layers of meaning, but they are all shot through with one pervasive, overriding loss. All right, the emotion of loss, both private and public loss, personal and universal loss. And above all, this loss overflows with sorrow and grief. So let's look at the actual music. First, as I mentioned, it uses many versions of his personal musical motif, DSCH. And this is actually derived from the German spelling of his name, Dmitri Shostakovich. Shostakovich in German uses a C, so the initials are DSCH. But you might say, what notes are those? Actually, in German music notation, S is E flat and H is B natural. So musically, the personal motif spells in our notation D, E flat, C, B natural. And those many self-quotations, confessional almost in nature, throughout the work have been identified by the British musicologist David Fanning. I mentioned there were 5 movements. They're connected in a dramatic arc and played without pause between, moving from desolation to anger to cynicism, then a desperate climax of grief that falls back on the desolation of the opening. The first movement, Largo, is a sorrowful fugue that's actually based on the DSCH motif and opens here, let's hear it, very quietly with that motif following in various voices. Here it is, first in the cellos, then the violas, second violins, first violins, the music now wanders off with a reference to his first symphony. But the mournful and heavy tone of the music is so pervasive. Now he brings in a lonely solo violin in a chromatic idea that weeps like tears coming down. The DSCH motif is never far away. Intertwining here with the solo. Next, another self-quotation from his Fifth Symphony, this wistful melody. The fugue seems to have been forgotten, but not our motif, DSCH, which reappears. resolving in the mournful key of C minor. Now, after the desolation of the first movement, the second movement leaps upon the scene with a ferocious and angry march. Here it is. Reminiscent of his Eighth Symphony, the music begins to slash. Soon crying out again, D-S-C-H. The anger of that opening march gives way very shortly to a quotation from his piano trio number 2, written in 1944 for his dear friend Ivan Solortinsky, who died suddenly that year. And it actually is in the style of a Jewish folk melody. Here it comes. Again, DSCH is never far away. After the ferocious anger of this second movement, Allegro molto march, we now move to the third movement, Allegretto, which is actually a kind of a scherzo, but not a laughing, funny scherzo in the manner of Beethoven, but rather an eerie one, more like Mahler. It starts out with a strident version of the DSCH motto, and then comes down into a waltz, the 3/4 time of a scherzo. But this is a eerie waltz, very soft and sharply articulated with staccato, detached articulation, and it's actually derived from the DSCH motif. But as I said, it's very eerie. First, the DSCH. Now we set up the waltz. And then now that kind of eerie, sardonic quality of the waltz moves to a second theme that extends the waltz with a kind of lyric idea, but it's a little bit exaggerated and almost mocking in tone. Here it comes. The trio of the movement moves over to the DSCH motto, or motif. So let's get to that. Next coming up is a quotation from his first cello concerto. Here it is. And then all of a sudden the mask comes off and the solo lonely cello seems to be weeping. With two solo violins circling around. Of course, the eerie waltz will return, and then we're going to move on to the fourth movement, Largo. This is the climax of the work. It is a terrible climax. It opens with pounding chords, kind of an outburst that signaled doom. It's actually a quotation from a film score he wrote about the young guard, a fallen hero. It recalls, if you will, the doom of Wagner's funeral march for his fallen hero, Siegfried. So here is the beginning of the longest movement in the quartet. Now this outburst of pounding chords of doom recurs throughout this movement, alternating with songs of lament and grief. The first song is actually a self-quotation from his censored opera, Lady Macbeth of the Mincense district. And it's an aria that Katerina, the protagonist, sings after she has poisoned her very abusive father-in-law in the opera. So let us hear that mournful lament. Pounding chords reappear to remind us of the doom of the fallen hero. And now DS, CH. We go on to our second lament. This is a quotation of a very well-known Russian prison song, tormented by grievous bondage. The third song is another self-quotation from his censored opera, Lady Macbeth, again another aria of the protagonist, Katerina. It's actually from towards the end of the opera when Katerina is longing for her lover, Sergei, and Shostakovich very poignantly gives this aria over to the solo cello. It is so poignant because Katerina doesn't know, but we know when we see the opera that Sergei is betraying her. The weeping cello does not close the movement, however. We return to those pounding chords of doom, and then a soft statement of D, S, C, H as we fall back exhausted into the finale. Another largo, another fugue in C minor, returning to the fugue of the opening. DSCH here presented in all voices with a counter melody wandering sadly along with it in mournful C minor. Eventually, the contrapuntal presentations of the motif will coalesce into one sad unison statement of the DSCH motif as the music and the motif fade away into nothingness. This is a deeply moving work that speaks to all of us. It gives voice to the wordlessness of human sorrow. I hope that you get a chance to listen to the whole thing. Thank you. My name is Rose Breckenridge.